doing these presentations is to explain and explore the amazing properties of food forests, and hope that you too will become a food forest evangelist and have some language to talk about food forestry and why it's so important when you have these conversations with your neighbors and community members. I started Portland Food Forest Initiative a couple years ago with the goal of normalizing food forests as urban and suburban landscaping, especially in place of grass lawns, as well as popularizing public understanding of food forestry and what that means, so that everyone now knows what a lawn is, but my goal is to make it so that everyone knows what a food forest is. Just like the average person walking down the street is totally familiar and fluent in the concepts of food forestry, especially in the urban context. We also provide guidance for cities, agencies, businesses, and homeowners in a consulting capacity, and encourage individual people to develop a relationship with the natural world through land stewardship and tending. And our organization, which is a nonprofit, pairs with homeowners in Portland who have large grass spaces, and we take them over for 5+ year periods, convert them to food forests, and then connect people who don't have access to land in stewardship positions with those sites. And then the harvest is split between the homeowner, the volunteers, and then excess goes to food distribution, mutual aid networks. We're not quite at that point yet, but once the trees start producing enormous amounts of produce, that shouldn't be a problem. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, and this presentation is sort of gets tailored to the needs of whoever the audience is. And in this case, we're going to talk about not so much how to turn your backyard into a food forest, although we will, but we're going to talk more about the food forests in the context of American society, and why we don't have them, why we should have them, and the benefits that they have for our communities and societies, as well as the transformative power of land tending for individual people such as ourselves. Before we talk, there's a few things I want to talk about before we get into food forestry specifically. One of them is placemaking. Have you guys ever heard of placemaking as a concept? Some yes, some no. I think this image really well illustrates what placemaking is. You have, both these are urban environments that are totally impermeable surfaces everywhere. They're both pretty unpleasant, I would say. The one on the left, image on the left, has no elements that communicate or connote culture, community, or beauty. On the right, you have a similarly bland urban space of impermeable surfaces, but at least it has a mural which connotes community, culture, and some beautification of an otherwise blank wall, right? So placemaking can be defined as infrastructure improvements that make urban spaces more livable. And placemaking is typically in the context of urban spaces. It doesn't really apply to rural spaces. Mark Lakeman, who founded City Repair, which is responsible for a lot of these intersection paintings in Portland, talks about intersection paintings in this really interesting way. He says he doesn't like the intersection paintings as just paint on asphalt, but he loves them as events that bring people together to create community, culture, and beautify an otherwise blank space that endures for a decade or so. They have to be touched up, but I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about this. They started doing these intersection paintings without permission from the city, and once the city saw them, they're like, all right, fine, you can do intersection paintings. But something that Mark Lakeman talks about is, this is our home, we don't need permission to improve it and to beautify it. And I think if we take that idea and apply it to our community and our local environment, we can make our spaces much more pleasant and create pro-social infrastructure. And I'll talk about what pro-social infrastructure means later on. But some elements of placemaking include, especially that we see in Portland, are gathering spaces, public gardens, such as botanic gardens, but also orchards and food forests that individual community members can participate in. Nature patches. In Portland public parks, there are these spaces where they've planted a bunch of native plants under dug for canopy, which has been there for 100 years, which beautifies the space and creates space for people to spend time among native plants in an urban context. Also pro-social infrastructure like benches and picnic areas and meeting spaces, but also events like street fairs. In Portland, there was an event called Last Thursday where they shut down this big, informally shut down a big section of one of the main streets, and this informal economy pops up, and there's all kinds of art and culture being interchanged. And of course, public art and murals are like the most obvious placemaking elements that you see in urban areas. And I guess graffiti would also be a potential placemaking, although typically it's not considered that. I want to do a quick exercise with you guys. So these are our two climax community ecosystems in Western Oregon, right? Old growth forest and Oaks Bend. I want you to just pick one, and if you're willing to, close your eyes and just envision it. Keep that one ecosystem in your mind. And now imagine you are a malevolent space alien who comes down to our beautiful planet and wants to destroy this ecosystem and permanently keep it destroyed and keep it from coming back and renewing. What would you do? What measures would you take to destroy this ecosystem and permanently replace it with something that will prevent it from coming back? You have any thoughts?
Pave it.
Yeah, pave it. That's the best way. Cut it down, put an impermeable surface over it, and pave it. So my whole point in this is I invite you guys to consider that paved surfaces, which are the primary surface in urban environments, are a deletion and exclusion of life that either displaces or exterminates all the life that occupies that space permanently. That's the whole point of it. Pavement also interferes with the water cycle. It prevents rainwater from penetrating the soil and percolating down. Causes a lot of downstream problems like heat sequestration and then radiation. But also runoff of toxic chemicals into the streams and rivers, which has all kinds of other problems. And I think this picture really illustrates the insanity of our culture. This is from a study, an article on a study by Berkeley Labs in California, studying cool pavement technologies, trying to figure out ways to cool down these pavement surfaces by painting them different colors, as opposed to planting trees, which just creates shade. You could just have an island of trees in this huge parking lot and still maintain the paved surface. So I think that's sort of very illustrative of the problem we're dealing with. Centralized food systems are, of course, rely on pavement and paved surfaces, and all the food we buy in grocery stores comes from these centralized food systems, with very few exceptions. They're inherently fragile because, for a lot of reasons, but mostly because they rely on petroleum, require monoculture, and of course monoculture is ecologically destructive because if you want to grow 100 acres of corn, you have to destroy or displace everything that was living there beforehand. And then you have to till, which degrades the soil, degrades the soil community and soil ecosystem. They're exploitative to humans and animals that are either part or not a part of the system, and degenerative, meaning that every year the soil and the ecosystem is in worse condition than it was the year before. And I think it's also important to understand that these systems are typically dedicated to nutrient-poor crops, not just that they're grown in nutrient-poor soil, but they're like oats, soy, wheat, barley, rye, rice are all calorie-rich, nutrient-poor crops, right? So if you subsist on just these crops, you're not going to get your micronutrient needs met. Decentralized food systems, on the other hand, which is what a food forest is, are flexible and resilient, require no petroleum, often are regenerative, meaning they make the ecosystem more healthy every year. They encourage community building, typically are almost always based on perennial nutrient-dense plants as opposed to annuals. We'll talk about some annuals that work well in these contexts later on. But they're long-term and intergenerational and produce free food for everybody, not just humans, but also creatures that need to eat. They build important skill sets for people who tend them, and food is freshly available off of the plant, most likely. I think the most important thing to understand is that foraging is an ancestral human right that we don't get to participate in on a normal basis, and even people like myself who are hobby urban foragers are not getting the majority of their calories from urban foraging because, well, there are a lot of walnut trees, chestnut trees, and apples growing, at least in Portland. I don't know what it's like here. I can't live off of those plants because there's just not enough. and there are no chickens and eggs and beef growing in Portland. So some elements of decentralized food systems are productive street trees like nut trees, fruit trees, public food forests and orchards, community gardens, urban farm CSAs, and in the rural context, agroforestry projects. And I think it's important to note that we need more decentralized food production, especially as climate change makes centralized food production more inconsistent and more fragile. And what you guys are trying to do in McMinnville is exactly that. And I think that will be an enormous benefit to the community. I'm going to play you guys a brief video, which will be a quick introduction to forest gardening and concepts in food forestry.
If you do nothing to a piece of land in temperate climates, it will become a forest. The forces of nature are actively moving the land towards a balanced, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. This is called succession. In southwest England, an unusual forest is growing. Nut trees, fruit trees, shrubs, and perennial vegetables are planted in a way that mimics a natural woodland. This forest garden is the life's work of Martin Crawford, an unconventional gardener who grows 500 edible plants with just a few hours of maintenance per month.
What we think of as normal in terms of food production is actually not normal at all. Annual plants are very rare in nature, and yet most of our agricultural fields are full of annual plants. It's not normal. What's normal is a more forested or semi-forested system. Forest gardens in a temperate climate tend to have 7 layers or so: high trees, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover layers, root crops, and climbers. So it includes directly useful plants, many types of fruit trees, both the common ones and much less common fruit trees, all the types of nuts, tuber crops, vegetables, medicinal plants, timber, but also logs that you might grow other things on, like mushrooms. There are also plants of indirect use, system plants, to help the system function better, and that includes nitrogen-fixing plants, mineral accumulators, plants to attract beneficial insects to eat all your pests. Forest gardens are very beautiful places to be in, because although they're managed, the management is light, so they have this very naturalistic feel, so that it is more like being out in nature than being in a cosmetic garden. It can seem a bit overwhelming. There's so many different species. You shouldn't let that stop you from beginning a project, because you don't have to know everything to begin with. Just start, plant some trees and go from there. It's not the gradually increasing temperatures that damage plants. It's the increase in extreme events, big storms, big winds, very heavy rain, hail, droughts. By having a very diverse system, whatever happens to the weather, most of your crops will probably do fine. Some may fail, some may do better. That's very important going into the future, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen to our weather. So by having a diverse system, it gives you maximum resilience.
Okay, cool. So that's a pretty good intro to food forestry and forest gardening. Martin briefly talks about ecological succession, and I think it's important to understand ecological succession in understanding why food forests are important in the urban context. As we talked about earlier, most surfaces in the urban landscape are either concrete, asphalt, or grass, and those are the pioneer stage ecological successionary stages, and they're maintained through a lot of energy and labor, right? So if you don't maintain a grass lawn, eventually it'll turn into a closed canopy climax ecosystem, right? Over hundreds of years. And it'll probably take 1,000 years for the parking lot to turn into a closed canopy forest. So ideally, we're going to take a pioneer stage ecosystem, such as a lawn, and jump it forward to a climax community ecosystem by planting a food forest, which after 10 or 20 years, depending on the canopy layer fruit tree or trees that you choose, will resemble some stage of climax community ecosystem. And then of course, once it's established, it requires very little labor, especially in relation to, or in comparison to our pioneer stage ecosystem. You guys know where lawns come from? The idea of lawns? These guys, yeah. So in the 1600s, the aristocracy and the history of lawns is like enormous, and it's like a whole book would be adequate to talk about it, but we're gonna do this really quickly. As an show of obscene wealth in 1600s England and France, the aristocracy decided to landscape their grounds with this decorative ground cover that didn't produce food for humans, right? And so, of course, you didn't have lawnmowers back then. You had scythes and peasants, and so you have peasants out there scything your lawn, keeping it nice and tidy, instead of growing crops for the people. And of course, we don't live in 1600s Western Europe anymore, but we still have lawns everywhere, especially in post-World War II housing developments. And that was done purposefully as a nod to that show of wealth in European Renaissance times. And so this is a choice made by developers, not made by people. If you move into a house, you're buying a house that probably has a lawn. It wasn't your choice to put a lawn there; it just pre-exists, right? So, of course, this lawn culture is propped up by the industrial boom after World War II and chemical surplus from warfare in the form of synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. And I love this quote from The Lawn Chemical Economy and Its Discontents. Lawns became a means of performing class values for the urban middle class, in which the condition of a lawn becomes representative of moral character and social reliability. This picture on the left is from a YouTube video shaming, this person shaming their neighbor for having an unkempt lawn. The social values associated with lawns are promoted and upheld by social pressure, laws, and chemical producers. So you have HOAs saying you have to keep your lawn this short, and you can't let it grow above so many 10 inches or whatever. And then of course, I'm sure we've all seen commercials for lawn seed fertilizer and lawnmowers, implying that a true good American has a lush green grass free of weeds. And of course, these guys are making a lot of money off of that, and it's successful. Their propaganda campaign is very successful. Americans use an enormous amount of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers per acre of lawn in the U.S. We can talk about more, but that's not really that relevant. Community gardens are super important to community health, but they're not food forests. And I want to just explain briefly why they're not food forests and why they're very different from food forests. They focus exclusively on annual crops, not perennials. They encourage individualism as opposed to collaboration, so you get your own little garden plot. You don't have to talk to anybody at all if you don't want to. They're generally more concentrated in affluent communities, which limits diversified access for historically marginalized populations. They require a lot of ongoing labor in terms of water and fertilizer, and typically when you get a community garden plot, you're getting highly degraded soil that doesn't have any nutrients in it and no soil structure or organic matter, which makes growing good crops challenging, inconsistent, and there's a big learning curve in having success in this context. And man, look at all that blank pathway. That could be food if we're a food forest, but inefficient design. So in Germany, there's this really interesting flip side to community gardens called Schrebergärten, and these are these little cottages on an allotment that for 70 euros a year you can get access to as long as there's one available. And this is sort of considered in German culture as something between a privilege and a right. It's cheap enough that everyone can afford to have one if they want. And it's thought of as a respite from urban life because they don't have these post-World War II suburban developments where every house has a big old lawn and you can grow a garden there if you want. So I think this is a cool thing to keep in mind. A lot of these plots have established fruit trees, but pretty much every German city has several of these in different areas. Okay, so let's talk about food forests finally. So food forestry is a proven model that humans have been implementing for thousands of years successfully. And it's based on ancestral methods of land tending. This is not something that permaculturalist hippies came up with in the last 20 years. This is based on ancient wisdom, but it's been improved dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. And some of the systems have been tweaked. it's a decolonization and desimplification of colonized space. And I think that's important to recognize that all this space is colonized, right? We came here, we chopped down the closed canopy, mature virgin forest and paved it over, and then grew corn and wheat and asphalt. And so that's a simplification of an extremely complex ecosystem. You know, if we have a lawn in place of a closed canopy forest, you're taking something that's incredibly complex and making it into one thing. So we're trying to flip that on its head and go back the other way. And of course, it's human stewarded and a multi-layered perennial polyculture, meaning that there are plants of all different sizes, shapes, and heights that are perennial, that come back on their own every year, and they're a polyculture, meaning it's not a monoculture. So food forests do a lot of things, but primarily they produce food, fiber, fuel, medicine, natural beauty, and habitat. They build soil incredibly rapidly, and of course soil is the biggest sink for carbon, right? So trees are great for carbon sequestration, but soil is even better. They capture and store rainwater, which is like one of the primary principles of permaculture. You want to store and slow and store rainfall. And they strengthen community and create ecological diversity and community resilience and climate resilience. So the basic component of a food forest is the tree guild, and typically you're going to have a tree guild either focused around a nut tree or a fruit tree as the canopy layer, depending on the size of the space you're working in. In an urban context, like in your backyard, you're probably not going to have 70-foot tall chestnut trees as your canopy layer, but you'll definitely have a 12-foot tall semi-dwarf fruit tree as your canopy layer. And scale down from that. The way in the northern hemisphere this works is the canopy layer trees in the north, and then everything that is shorter progressively gets shorter to the south of the canopy layer. So it's maximizing solar, maximizing sun on leaves effectively, which is how you sequester carbon, because of course photosynthesis is breaking of the CO2 bonds, right, between the carbon and oxygen. The plant keeps the carbon and exhales the oxygen as a waste product using the power of the sun. So you have your canopy layer, which is in an urban context a semi-dwarf fruit tree, or maybe like a hazelnut. Sub-canopy layer is going to be a dwarf fruit tree or a very large shrub like a goumyberry that can get to be about 8 feet tall. Shrub layers are going to be 5 feet or shorter with a woody stem. Herbaceous layer is going to be veggies, biomass accumulators, herbs, pollinator flowers. That's a pretty diverse category. And then your ground cover layer is going to be, and the way that I've been doing it are strawberries, sweet potatoes, and squash to keep the ground cool. Alliums, potatoes, and I'm trying peanuts and ginger this year, and so far they're working great. For your root layer, and then vining layer in this context is going to be typically grape and hardy kiwi, although you can do passion flower and hops as well. And using deep mulch wood chips, wine cap mushrooms, wine cap stropharia are the mushroom of choice in this system, and they produce like an unbelievably abundant amount of food with very little input initially. Yeah.
Can we talk about planning time in terms of what succession you would want us to start with if we were trying to go about this?
Yeah, I'll talk about that later.
Okay.
That's a good question, yeah. First, you plant the woody cross. That's the short answer. So two forms of food forestry are syntropic agroforestry, and agroforestry means trees in the context of agriculture, so you're adding in trees. And this is an extremely productive and intensive use of space. And then forest gardening, which is probably more what you guys are going to be doing here in McMinnville on that property. This has meandering pathways, it has circular tree guilds as opposed to linear tree guilds in the syntropic agroforestry model. Can have pro-social spaces for gathering, and it encourages pro-social behavior and interaction between community members. So I love syntropic agroforestry. I think it's the coolest thing ever. And this is based on ancestral land tending methods. You have your tree rows, and within those tree rows you have every layer of the guild. So you have all your 7 or 9 layers depending on what you're doing. And you have your canopy layer trees. In this context, they're typically going to be timber trees, and they're spaced out 15, 20, 25, or 40 feet, depending on how big they are and what you're growing. And in between the tree rows, you have your annual veggie rows, which are producing immediately. So you don't have to wait for the trees to come into maturity and production. You're getting a yield in the first year with a polyculture. So you're not just growing just corn or just beans, you're growing chard and squash and I don't know what else is in there, it's hard to see, but lots of different things. And additionally, you typically want to have biomass accumulators in your food forest that you can chop and drop and add as mulch to build soil. And in this syntropic forest, food forest I visited outside of Mexico City, they have this very rapidly growing grass growing on the edge of one of the tree rows that can be chopped and dropped as mulch and fertility because they don't have chip drop in rural Mexico. So you have your fertility as a closed loop system there. You can also graze animals on fallen fruit or spoiled vegetables and produce, and they will fertilize as they go, and then you can harvest really high quality meat and animal products off of that. On the left is a site that I've been stewarding at Jean's Farm in edge of Milwaukee in Portland. And this is just an apple orchard with a bunch of weeds on the ground, and we planted squash and a bunch of brassicas under the apple trees, so you get 2 yields. But it's a good thing we did because last June there was a hailstorm that destroyed all the apples, but all the veggies rebounded and produced a ton of veggies. So we would have had nothing due to the hailstorm had we not planted vegetables in the understory and this ground cover. The forest garden, in contrast to the syntropic agroforestry, is not so much focused on producing an enormous amount of food. It's more focused on producing habitat and community. And this uses circular tree guilds instead of linear tree guilds, and it typically has meandering pathways. This can be designed in infinite number of ways, but depending on the space, in permaculture design, you take into account sectors. So if you're trying to maintain privacy on this side, you're going to plant certain things. If you're trying to maintain shade on this side, you're going to plant certain things. And so we're taking more of those things into example. In the syntropic agroforestry design, we're not only thinking about blocking off the neighbors, or the neighbors' prying eyes. We're just thinking about making food and growing north to south tree rows. So this, we're not so much concerned with north to south tree rows. We're concerned with creating pro-social design elements such as benches, gathering spaces, picnic areas, meditation, prayer spaces. And you can still incorporate annual veggies into this system, such as self-seeding veggies, or you can just literally plant a tomato start or a kale start in this system, or you can broadcast as well. And I think one of the most important things about this space, especially in the context of a community food forest, is that this is a place where people, community members, to gather, to work together, harvest together, and to celebrate our connection to each other and the natural world, and to be gorillas and just eat food, just forage, walk around and forage, and eat tasty berries. That's the best thing. Okay, so in thinking about what plants to plant in a food forest, there are some things to consider. We need plants to provide ecosystem services to each other and to the habitat. So things we want to think about are biomass accumulators, things you can chop and drop, like that big row of grass in the Mexican syntropic design. Soil infiltrators, which have big root systems that break up compacted soil. Deep nutrient accumulators, which send down roots deep and bring up a lot of biomass, and then you can chop and drop that, and then you bring that deep soil nutrients to the top and let it decompose on the surface. And a really good example of a plant that does all 3 of those things is comfrey. And you can't get rid of it. It comes back again and again and again, and you chop and drop it, and you're improving your soil by doing that. It's also providing nectar for insects. Nitrogen fixers are important because unless you're importing nitrogen in the form of compost, animal manure, or synthetic fertilizer, the best way to get nitrogen into the soil is by planting plants that put nitrogen into the soil directly, fixed atmospheric nitrogen. Pest deterrents and predator insect habitat is really important. So our food forests are going to have integrated pest management in them, so we don't have to spray chemicals or pesticides, which have all kinds of deleterious effects to the ecosystem. And self-seeding plants. So there are annuals that we can plant in these systems that ideally seed on their own, so they come back on their own year after year. And so like cherry tomatoes are a great example of that. Other rules to consider are spreading herbaceous and ground cover plants. So like strawberries, you plant one strawberry plant, and then in a couple years it takes over and you have tons of strawberry plants, and it's covering the soil, keeping it cool, and providing a yield. And ideally most of these plants are providing a yield for humans and or for wildlife. In at least 2 of my food forests, there are trees that just pre-exist. There's some dogwood trees and there's a hornbeam tree, and those are never going to produce food, but they provide trellises for grapes and kiwi and other things that we can plant. And they're going to be there for many, many decades, certainly longer than a trellis that I could, buy or slap together out of treated lumber or a metal frame. Coppice and timber trees, I think this is more in the context of an 11-acre food forest like we've been talking about. Coppice forestry is a way of taking a tree such as hazelnut, and hazelnut is the most typically coppiced tree historically. You chop it down, and then it comes back from the roots over and over and over. So you can do it for hundreds of years and continue to harvest lumber from that system. So the coppice forestry system that's been done in Europe for over 1,000 years, and it renews the life cycle of the plant every time you do it. Easily propagated plants that root easily and sucker are great to have, such as plants you can take a cutting from, such as fig, elderberry, currants, gooseberries are all plants you can just cut, stick in the ground, or stick in a pile of soil, and they'll grow a new plant. And so you're able to provide more plants for your community and also abundance. That's a great way to produce income if you're growing food in a food forest in your house and you want to start a nursery on your land. Easily planted seeds are great because they are much more likely to germinate than smaller seeds. So big seeds like a fava bean or a squash seed are much more likely to germinate than will an amaranth seed. Seeds you can broadcast, and in our food forest we broadcast a lot of buckwheat and daikon radish, and buckwheat provides nectar for insects and biomass, and daikon is a soil infiltrator, produces food for humans, and puts organic matter into the soil when you leave it to decompose. The Ruth Stout method, is anyone familiar with Ruth Stout method? She's this awesome old-timer gardener, and she would just drop a potato on the ground and cover it with straw, and it would just grow. And so instead of like digging a trench, planting potatoes, she would just drop a potato, put straw on it, walk away, and come back a few months later. You have potatoes. You don't get the yields that you would get. Can I close that door?
Yeah, yeah.
So distractible.
Oh, that's much better.
You don't get the yields.
Yeah, so with root stock, you don't get the yields that you would if you tilled the soil and put your potatoes in perfectly and then mound them. But it's almost no labor to do so. Thank you. Plants that ripen throughout the season, especially into winter, like persimmons are great to have. You don't want all your plants, you don't have an apple orchard where everything just drops at the same time and you're stuck with a billion apples and not enough labor to process them. And of course, plants you enjoy eating. You don't want to be growing things that you want to eat. So here's an example of the first site we planted last year. This is a backyard in Coy neighborhood in Northeast Portland. It was just a crappy lawn, underwatered, very unhappy. Covered it with this brown contractor's paper from Lowe's. It's great, highly recommend it. It's not too expensive. And then at least 6 inches of wood chips. I didn't do enough here, which I found out later, but at least 6 inches of wood chips. And then you plant it. This was a syntropic design with tree rows spaced out 13 feet apart, and then you canopy layered trees within those tree rows spaced at 13 feet. And then within 3 months, you have a pretty abundant system. And of course, this year, it's even more developed. And these are the tree rows. And you can see there's just like so much stuff growing together and growing happily together. And you don't have to have like one apple tree every 10 or 13 feet. You can have all this stuff growing together. and it's totally fine. There's no drawbacks to planting like this. And especially it's there's like endless benefits, but some of the benefits are the more density you plant. Like of course, in 20 years this is going to be too dense, but that's fine because some stuff isn't going to make it. It'll get girdled by a rabbit, or it won't produce produce that we like. It doesn't taste good, or it's on a subpar variety, or it's climate's going to change and some stuff won't make it. But the diversity is its resilience. Another example of a food forest, this is a Jean's Farm, one of our demonstration sites. Same idea, cover a weedy, untended market garden site, and it just became this booming food forest after a few months. That was planted in April. This is Rhythm Seed Farm, which is a nonprofit seed farm in Northeast Portland. Another example of turning a lawn into an abundant space. And then this I think is really interesting. This is in Bend, a church in Southeast Bend, Oregon. And of course, Bend gets almost no rain. They get like 13 inches of precipitation a year. A lot of that is snow. The soil's terrible, and it's cold and dry there. And through using deep mulch wood chip method food forestry, they're able to produce an enormous amount of high quality, nutrient dense food. And there's not a lot of orchards in Bend, right? So it's pretty astonishing that they're able to do that. And so deep wood chip mulch is the foundation of food forests in a temperate climate, at least the ones that we've been doing and that are successful in our part of the world. And these are wood chips. These aren't wood chips you buy from a supplier. These are directly from the back of an arborist truck. They're called Romule wood chips. Romule meaning branches, and they have lots of leaves. And the branches are leaves and branches are where the sugars are in a tree's physiology. The trunk of the tree is mostly cellulose and carbon, which is great. You need carbon because you need brown and green to create soil for the organic matter to break down and create more soil. But so getting wood chip drops during the growing season while there are leaves on the trees is much better than getting wood chips in January where the trees have no leaves and all the energy is in the roots. They're through chipdrop.org, which is a website that connects arborists to homeowners or landowners. Usually you have to pay about $20 per load, depending on the demand of your neighborhood. Sometimes you have to pay more, but $20 usually gets you a load. Yep.
I signed up for that. I'm noticing that it's 8 weeks, 9 weeks before you get one. Are you suggesting, put in like an extra $20 and you
Did you put in $20?
No,
Oh.
I just.
You'll never get it if you don't put in money.
Okay.
Yeah, you gotta put in at least $20.
Okay.
It's chipdrop.org?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can also call arborists in your neighborhood, just like go on Google Maps and find an arborist and just call them and say, hey, will you drop chips to my house? Sometimes they'll do that, but some of them only go through chipdrop.org. And there's not a lot of eucalyptus in this part of the world, but specify no eucalyptus in your chip drop. Ideally, you're not getting conifers, you're getting deciduous trees, but conifers are okay, but sometimes I've gotten loads from chip drop that are just like dun fir branches and needles, and that's like, better off not getting a load at that point. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually it's like a nice mix of a bunch of different stuff. So wood chips suppress most weeds when you put them on top, when you put them 6 inches on top of this brown contractor's paper, which you can buy from Lowe's, as I stated before. It's about $12 per roll when you buy more than 4 rolls of it. It comes in 400-foot rolls that are about 3 feet wide. This builds soil organic matter really rapidly as it breaks down. The average lawn soil, at least in Portland, is about 3 to 5% organic matter. And for every 1% you increase organic matter per acre, you're going to have water holding capacity of 16,000 more gallons and fix 10 tons of carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. And so if you go from 5% organic matter to 10% organic matter on a 1 acre plot, you're going to store 80,000 gallons of water, right? And that's you're going to increase your water holding capacity. And that is illustrated by this picture here. This is a place called God's Gardens next to a Seventh-day Adventist church in Northeast Portland, where they have this extremely deep mulch garden there where they don't water after they plant the start. So they plant the start, water it in, and then let it go, and then they never water throughout the summer. And of course, you have all these watermelons, and they're full of water. It's where the water come from. It came from this incredibly nutrient-dense, rich soil from 10 years of adding 4 to 6 inches of wood chips every year.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty cool. If you guys are ever in Portland, I highly recommend checking it out. It's at 55th and Going in Northeast Portland.
55th and what?
Going.
Going Street.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And it's actually right around the corner from one of my sites, and I'm having a tour on June 29th and July 27th. I think the 29th one is pretty much full, but the July 27th site visit is open and it's free, and I can direct you to this. It's like two blocks from the food forest. I can direct you there. Wood chips also create habitat for soil microorganisms and mycelial networks, and of course, mycelium, mushroom, the organism that creates mushrooms, connotes disease and pest resistance to woody crops growing in the soil. You guys have heard about how trees communicate with each other in the forest, and when one tree gets eaten by an insect, it'll tell the other trees, hey, there is this insect eating us, put out your your insecticide chemicals through that mycelial network in the soil. And the mycelium feeds off of root exudates from the trees, so that's like sugars that the trees are putting out, carbohydrates that they're putting out to the soil, and in exchange, the mycelium confers pathogenic resistance to the trees. Pretty amazing. Interesting to note that in a cornfield where you've destroyed the mycelial network and there's no communication between plants, there is none of that conferred resistance, and there's no communication between the plants, or there's negligible communication between the plants. That's part of the inherent fragility of monocrops. Cool. Speaking of monocultures, monoculture orchards are the polar opposite of a food forest. So you have an innate susceptibility to pest and disease, and due to poor ecological practices, these systems rely on petroleum in a lot of different ways, but they specifically rely on pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, fertilizers, and most importantly, irrigation to keep them alive. These trees would die on their own. If you go like an almond orchard in California, it's just bare soil, blasted by the sun, and these trees are sprayed with pesticide and herbicide multiple times a year to keep them alive, keep them from being devoured, because there's no predator insect habitat, there's no diversity, and their lack of diversity is their weakness. And of course, if you've ever driven up I-5 from Southern California, you see these billboards saying like, save our water rights, farmers need water too, like politicians are killing the California farmer. And of course, there's no soil infiltration because they have no roots penetrating the soil, there's no porosity, and so when it rains, the water just runs off, taking nutrients with it, and you have to drain a river or aquifer to keep these sites watered. It's just insanity. Real briefly, if you guys have not watched a bunch of videos by Andrew Millison, Brad Lancaster, and there's one amazing one by Neil Spackman on the Al Baida project in Saudi Arabia. These are all people who've been doing and documenting big time earthworks, water capture projects around the world in really progressive and sometimes using ancestral methods to re-green spaces that have been denuded and destroyed by overgrazing or just the progression of desertification through deforestation. Andrew Millison has some really amazing videos, and Brad Lancaster lives in Tucson, which is like nothing but impermeable surfaces, and they get torrential rains, monsoon rains at certain times of year, and he cut away the curb in front of his house and dug these rain gardens in his parking strip, and it's just amazing. There's like this abundant green in what's otherwise like a blasted, soilless desert lands or urban landscape. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so polyculture food forests are the antithesis of monoculture orchards, right? They promote natural pest management through ecological diversity. They mimic a naturally balanced ecosystem and eventually a closed canopy climax community forest. They're not as susceptible to pest and disease, although there is some pest susceptibility in these systems, but that can be remedied typically through planting more pollinator and predator habitat plants. The wood chip mulch prevents soil pathogens from splashing up onto the plants when it rains, so that's one of the biggest benefits of having wood chips. Bare soil is the worst. It's like the pavement of the natural world. It's a mortal sin in my book. And so keeping soil covered, and keeping roots in the soil is incredibly important. It also, by adding organic matter and adding roots in the ground, increases soil porosity and infiltration rates. And being able to infiltrate water is how you avoid flooding on a large scale, especially in agricultural settings. Rats are not an issue in food forests. I have heard some people express concerns about it, but it's really not an issue. You talk to anyone who maintains a food forest, they'll tell you they're not an issue. The one place there could be concern is with fallen fruit. If fallen fruit is not picked up quickly, that can attract rodents, but where you guys are proposing to plant a community food forest, there's no way rats would get there from an urban environment. But you can build rat-resistant compost bays as demonstrated at Kailash Eco Village in Portland. These are cinder block bays that have hardware fabric, hardware cloth on the bottom to keep rats from burrowing underneath, but they're also open on top, which exposes rats to their predators, to raptors. So rats don't want to be exposed to open sky. And these, there's a really amazing video. If you search Kailash Eco Village and Kirsten Dirksen, there's this beautiful tour of their site. And they took this guy, Ole, bought a dilapidated apartment complex and turned it into this amazing intentional community permaculture site in southeast Portland by Holgate and 34th, if you're ever near there. Oh, and so yeah, proactively mitigating waste through putting in compost bays or chop and dropping plants that have lived out their life cycle. And additionally, rats, maybe, but squirrels are definitely edible. And in an urban context, I've eaten squirrels in Portland and they're fine. So we're talking about disease and pest susceptible plants. If we want to avoid those, there are a lot of plants that are not disease and pest susceptible in our climate and ecosystem. These are a bunch of them. The ones with asterisks next to them are productive outside of the fall. So chestnut, olive, and persimmon are ripe into winter. Hardy kiwi is ripe in the very end of summer. Medlar is ripe in end of November, beginning of December, and honeyberries are ripe end of May, beginning of June. So they're one of the first things that comes into ripeness. A lot of these are not great for transport and shelf stability. So like cornelian cherries, you kind of have to eat them right when they're falling off the tree. You can't store them. You can preserve them, of course, but you're not going to be able to put them on the shelf at the grocery store like you would a banana. Same for pawpaws. It's important to have nitrogen fixers in your food forest system, as I was talking about earlier. All of the legumes are nitrogen fixers, and peas are edible, clover is sort of edible, fava and other beans are edible, and there are lupines that are edible as well. In the shrub and subcanopy layer, autumn olive and goumyberry are both members of the Elaeagnus family, and those are nitrogen fixing. And seaberry is also a nitrogen fixer, and seaberry is considered, I've heard people use the word nutraceutical, which kind of makes me cringe, but they're extremely nutrient dense and they're delicious. Goumi and autumn olive are both really high in lycopene, like 20 times out of a tomato, so they say. so that's pretty cool. And then alder is a nitrogen fixer and also can be used for mushroom logs and timber. Honey locust is debatably a nitrogen fixer, but it definitely produces good timber, has high BTUs, and produces dappled shade. And then nut trees, and I think nut trees are something you guys should definitely consider in the context of this 11-acre food forest, produce an enormous amount of return on investment. You plant one nut in the ground, which costs nothing, or maybe a few cents, and you can have a tree that lives for hundreds or thousands of years and produces 100 to 300 pounds of food per year. And that is nothing else that you can spend your money on that gets you that kind of return on investment. Unless you buy Bitcoin in like 2013. So that's pretty cool. So nuts are the best strategy for passive food security. They provide fat, carbs, and protein. And fat and protein are really hard to come by without integrating animals, without eating animals. And they just drop these things on the ground. It's free food on the ground for anybody who can pick it up. The cool thing about chestnuts, either European, Chinese, Korean, or a hybrid of any of those combinations, are pretty much rodent resistant, so squirrels can't get to them for the most part because they're covered in a spiky burr, and then usually the burr drops or the nuts fall directly out of the burr and you can pick them up off the ground. Whereas walnuts and hazelnuts are much more susceptible to rodents. But if you have an open space all around a large community food forest where squirrels are not going to want to traverse, they're much less likely to be picking off the nuts. But you can also harvest the nuts before they become fully ripe and let them ripen on the shelf as opposed to on the tree. But that takes a lot of focused attention for the harvesters. One thing I want to talk about real quick is that chestnuts are analogous in their nutrient content to corn, so they're just like carbs, like straight carbs, just like very low protein in them. Hazelnuts and walnuts are much higher fat and higher protein. You can also grow nut trees in high quantity in a very small space. This is one of the nut tree nursery spaces that we have in Portland, and you can grow, there's like 130 English walnuts growing in that one bed, and it costs maybe $60 to build that bed, just in materials. And then you can, once they lose their leaves after the first year of growing, you can go and plant them wherever you want while they're dormant. So annual maintenance in a food forest, as Martin Crawford implies, is fairly light, especially once it's established. You can plant things every year if you want, but you don't have to. Once it's planted initially, you don't have to really keep planting things. Chop and drop is important, keeping the space from becoming overgrown. And then harvest can be done either in coordinated community groups, or it can be done by an individual person going through harvesting or foraging and snacking at their convenience. There really isn't much cleanup. That's mostly just redistribution of fallen, spoiled fruit to livestock, and plenty of livestock around, I'm sure. That could easily be routed to turn fallen fruit and spoiled vegetables into eggs and meat. And then pruning is going to be important in this context because you don't want to have a 30-foot tall cherry tree. You want to have a 10-foot tall cherry tree that's maintained the height that most people can reach most of the fruit on. And so that requires training of community members who are going to be doing that pruning. Mulch eventually becomes an integrated part of the food forest, but initially delivering wood chips to a food forest in this site is going to be really important over the first 5 or 10 years. Eventually the soil sort of stops absorbing the broken down wood chips, and you're kind of set for a while. You don't have to keep mulching after a while. It reaches this point of saturation. There are a ton of educational opportunities in the context of a community food forest. For me, educational tools are important, so I think that's part of the evangelism part, explaining to people why this is important, everybody who comes to my food forest is just like, oh my God, this is amazing, I want this. I want to be in this space, I wanna have this in my backyard, I want to be involved in this in some capacity. And that's really encouraging to me, as someone who's obsessed with food forests. But this can be, people of all ages can participate in this educational component. Kids, elders, anyone in between. It's a great way to demonstrate pruning and plant care, because you have lots of fruit trees, and demonstrating what a properly pruned fruit tree looks like. Most fruit trees in an urban environment are just like a disaster, right? Because they were pruned, 20 years ago by someone who didn't know what they were doing, and then ever since then they've just been like hacked at by the homeowner just to keep it from becoming overgrown, and it just creates a crazy, chaotic tree form. So having perfectly pruned tree and in contrast to poorly pruned trees is really helpful. And of course, getting kids away from screens. Most parents are concerned with their kids and screen time. Of course, it's hard to be on your phone when your hands are covered in dirt or you're wearing gloves covered in dirt. So that's one of my favorite parts about being in food forests is I'm not looking at my phone, I'm looking at plants. And kids who participate in planting and tending of a food forest are much more likely to develop a sense of agency and ecological literacy and attention to the natural world, and develop lasting responsibility, a sense of lasting responsibility. As you plant a tree when you're 8 years old, you'll come back and see it the rest of your life and be proud of it. A community food forest necessitates community engagement, so this is not something that one person can do, it's something that everyone has to do. And I think once people see the benefits of it, without attending a food forest class where someone's telling you why a food forest is amazing, but actually going into a food forest and experiencing it for yourself, I think that is a really transformative and powerful experience for anybody, especially people who are feeling alienated or isolated in our American culture. So that's developing a place-based relationship. And it's a great way for knowledge sharing and mentorship by people who have experience and expertise and wisdom gathered over decades. They can share it with young people and people who are less experienced. And of course, connection to each other and celebration. So having a community food forest with engaging your neighbors creates strong relationships between neighbors and strengthens neighborhoods and the society of the population. There are well-documented mental health benefits to nature immersion, and in all these studies they are talking about nature immersion in the context of like going for a walk in the forest, and like that's awesome, going for a walk in the forest is great, and it has all these positive benefits, right? But actually participating in a community-oriented green space where you're tending the land is way more impactful and has much bigger beneficial impacts than does just wandering through the forest. I don't know enough about McMinnville to that this is really relevant here, but I certainly in Portland and other urban spaces where historically marginalized communities are relegated to these areas of endless concrete, heat islands, food deserts, and industrial pollution. A food forest dropped into the center of one of these neighborhoods is going to have enormous benefits as far as access to nutrient-dense food, access to green space, and access to those things for people of all socioeconomic and cultural standings. Another thing that's really important to understand is that there's a violence reduction capacity and impact of food, green spaces specifically, but food forests as well. And I think the most easily digestible way to understand this is that for every 1% you increase green space in a neighborhood, you reduce violent crime and property crime by 1%. And so I assume that there's a tipping point where you get beyond maybe like 15% where it becomes much more than 1%. Per 1%. So if you have 16% of a neighborhood as green space, you're going to get 20% reduction in violent crime and property crime, as opposed to having 10% green space and 10% reduction in violent crime or property crime. That's my hunch. I have not verified that scientifically, but I think that is a very important component to the importance of food forest. And in my experience, working in Portland, is that the city is absolutely not going to permit this to happen. And that the only way it's gonna happen, and the only way it has happened, is with citizens coming together and saying, we're gonna do this, what are you gonna do? You can't stop us, right? And you guys are doing it on private land, I think that's the best way to do it. But yes, city's never gonna allow it, that's just not how cities work in this part of the world. Although, I will say, smaller towns are much more likely to do large-scale food forestry projects. I was working with the City Council of Cottage Grove to put pro-food forestry language into their city charter. And I was stunned that they wanted it, but the mayor was down, like the city council people were down. So that's really encouraging, but in Portland, that's never gonna happen. At least I'm not holding my breath. So yeah, lots of benefits to large-scale food forestry. I think one that I haven't talked about yet is that if you guys successfully create this multi-acre food forest, that's gonna be something that doesn't really exist anywhere else in the country. There's one in Boston, there's one in Atlanta, there's sort of one in Seattle, the Beacon Hill Food Forest. If this is implemented intelligently and in a way that creates lasting abundance, it will be something that people will come from all over the world to see, because it just doesn't exist in this country, and it doesn't really exist anywhere else. There's very few food forests in the world, in Western countries that demonstrate how land can be desimplified and turned into abundant, complex, closed canopy ecosystem. Martin Crawford's is like the one example that's publicly accessible.
The British country.
Yeah, that's in Darlington. I'm going there in September if anyone wants to join me. Okay, so these are a couple designs I did, just kind of give you an idea. These are both forest garden designs. And so you see there's a lot of plants in there, and that's not even all the plants. That's just like the big ones that you're gonna be actually putting in the ground. It doesn't include the broadcast plants, or plants we'll be planting in a few years once these other ones are established. So this is a design of this is a centropic design that we planted this year in Southeast Portland. Just the woody plants are incorporated in this design. But things to consider are what's available locally. What can you get easily from local nurseries? What do you want to eat, of course? What grows well in your climate? You don't want to be planting things that are super outside your USDA climate hardiness zone, but you might want to plant loquats because in 20 years they might be producing fruit. They're not producing fruit right now because they're getting frozen. They can't really produce fruit when it gets below 20 degrees. What grows well in your soil? Soil can be improved and changed, but there are some plants that want well-drained soil or want acidic soil. But I will say that I've seen plants that want very different things growing in a deep mulch wood chip orchard growing just fine together, even though they in theory want different things. Like one wants acidic soil, one wants basic soil.
Just one thing, Dan, I've noticed that in a forest, it doesn't frost on the ground, whereas in an open field,
Totally.
it does, so.
Yeah.
I could see how something like that would change, like you could grow frost tolerant plants.
Totally. Yeah. The microclimates that you're creating are huge. Yeah, and it stays cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, right? Yeah, it's pretty cool. Who are you growing food for? Are you trying to grow food for just the community? You're trying to grow food for the unhoused populations? So do you want to grow things that you eat right off the tree, or do you want to grow things that are shelf stable, like apples, where you can like store an apple for a few months and give out throughout the year? How much labor do you have at hand? How much labor do you want to expend? What's your budget per square foot, per acre? And also consider duo plantings, where you're planting two trees that need pollination or pollination for each other. So like apple trees, you plant two of them in the same hole more or less, and that way you meet their pollination needs without having to rely on an apple tree over there getting pollinated by an apple tree over there. The bees going back and forth, or just the wind will blow the pollen from two trees next to each other to each other.
Okay.
So, how do you plant a food forest? Well, I think laying out the plants on the ground in relation to the design is helpful, and then measuring them, so you're delineating your pathways with string and stakes so you can like visually see it. If you just put the plants on the ground, it's kind of hard to see, but if you have your pathways delineated, I think that really, really helps. And then getting a bunch of people to plant. People love planting. People are not as excited to maintain as they are to plant. So keep that in mind. I found that's consistent. Once the plants are producing food and people can snack on the food, then they're much more likely to come in and help maintain. But that between stage is kind of tricky. So when you're planting a tree, you don't plant anything in the wood chips. You plant it into the soil below the wood chips. So you rake back the wood chips down to the soil level. You dig your hole. Remove the soil onto a tarp or a plastic bag of some sort, so it doesn't get mixed into the wood chips don't get mixed into the soil. Plant the tree, backfill the hole with the soil, and then push the wood chips back over, covering the exposed soil. So we don't want any exposed soil in this system. And then you can inoculate those wood chips with wine caps or Friary Swan. I got a big donation from Field and Forest. I'm sure they'd be glad to donate. You guys, if you wanted, you know, this stuff goes a long way. Just a little, it's a sawdust, a block of sawdust that's been inoculated with mycelium. You just take a little bit, you sprinkle it in the wood chips and fold the wood chips over, and I mean, it's just like, this bed on the side of my house, it's my housemate's bed, and she's so annoyed with me because wood chips keep popping up, and mushrooms keep popping up and knocking her plants out. And I just like, I don't even know how it happened. I just put a few wood chips in there, but they just keep coming. She's annoyed, but you know, understanding. So yeah, you water in the trees, and then you don't have to really water much past that.
Can I just ask a question? So I'm a little bit afraid of mushrooms just in general,
Yeah.
but if you plant something like that, is it kind of monocultural, or could like a poisonous mushroom come up right next to it?
Usually your poisonous mushrooms or non-wine cap mushrooms are going to come up elsewhere where these wine caps have not established. I don't know, there's not a good picture here, but when you take up a handful of wood chips where the wine caps have been growing, it's just like nothing but wine cap mycelium. It's so dense, nothing else can grow there. Other mushrooms I see typically in wood chips are ink caps, which they're, I guess, sort of edible, but you don't really want to eat them if you're drinking alcohol, because they can kill you if you do that. But like, they look so different, they don't look anything alike. And you know, when I first started growing wine caps, I was like, all right, I'm gonna ID these like thoroughly, very thoroughly, so I'm 100% sure that what I'm eating is a wine cap mushroom. And then I like chickened out, I was like, no, I'm not gonna do it. And then like after the third time I did that, I was like, okay, fine. I ate a little slice and it was fine. I ate a whole mushroom and I was fine. And now it's like, okay, I can identify a wine cap. I've seen it a million times. I know exactly what they look like. I know that their spores look like this. I know that their gills look like this. I know that the crown and the vulva look like this. I know what the stem looks like. I know what they look like at all their different life stages, because they start out these little dark wine red caps and they become huge silvery, or huge bronze caps, and they become speckled as they get dried out and older. And so seeing them flush over and over, you can identify them and develop a relationship with them.
Okay.
I've heard that from other people before. Yeah.
Where do you get the spawn?
Online.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if there was one that you liked.
Field and Forest is who I've
Field
gone
and
through.
Forest.
How tasty are the wine caps?
On a scale of 1 to 10, they're like a 4. So like,
It's not really great.
if like a Morel is a 10, they're in a Chanterelle is like a 7, in a white mushroom from the store is a 1.
Mm.
They're in like a Cremini is like a 5, like a 4.
Okay.
But enough butter and salt, you know. Has anyone eaten them? Have you eaten them? Emily?
Yeah,
Yeah, what do you think?
they're good. Yeah, the butter and salt thing. Actually, Quinn gave me some that you gave me.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I got a lot of
They're
them.
okay.
Yeah. They're okay, right?
They're okay.
Do oyster mushrooms grow in wood chips?
Kind of. Yeah, I've successfully grown them once, but they don't take over like the wine caps do. And the thing about the wine caps is, you know, making mushrooms you can eat, but they're also breaking down the wood chips in the soil, and that's the most important thing. And you're obtaining a yield, so it's like you're getting 2 for 1, you know. Yeah, prune trees to open center. Okay, that is the most important tool you're gonna need in establishing a food forest. It's this orange plastic polyfork from A&M Leonard, $75. It's like the best 7610 I've ever spent, 7619 I've ever spent. It makes shoveling wood chips way easier than using a shovel or a hay fork. They're incredible, they're durable. We use contractor paper instead of cardboard. Cardboard potentially has PFAS, rubber chemicals, bad stuff in it. Don't want to be introducing that into a food producing system. The rest of this is all pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, that's the presentation. If you guys have any questions, hit me.
Yes, the contractor paper you're talking about, is that breaking down or is that permanent stuff?
Yeah, so that it's like a construction paper kind of like you used as a kid, but it comes in a roll. The benefit of that is it's flexible, and so it'll smother grass. When it gets wet, it just like it sticks to the grass and adheres to it. It won't stop dandelions, thistle, blackberry, or bindweed from coming up through it. But dandelions are fine. You can eat them. You can also just chop and drop them or pull them up. Bindweed, you just got to deal with it either way. You pull it up, and then thistle and blackberry, you have to remediate by hand either way, whether or not you put down wood chips or not. So, that's your question.
What about crabgrass or quackgrass, or whatever you call it, the runners?
Yeah, I haven't had any quackgrass in any of my sites. I've heard it can break through. Am I imagining that I heard someone say that flame weeder kills quackgrass? I don't know. Can't remember. A flame weeder, like a propane flame weeder. Is there any quackgrass or invasive stuff on that land?
Probably a little, yeah.
I mean, maybe it's just like part of the ecosystem. You know, you don't have to kill everything, but if it's gonna like stab, if it's gonna stab you like blackberry, you probably don't want it. You know. So.
Can you go into a little more detail about what chop and drop means, what it looks like how I can understand? I mean, you're kind of cutting with a machete grass that then just falls and covers. But are you doing the same, like pruning larger things? And are you chopping real small?
Good question. You can. I've seen fig trees used in chop and drop, but typically it's going to be herbaceous plants that don't have a woody stem. So comfrey's great. Another excellent one is sorghum Sudan grass, which it looks like corn until it gets really big and produces like a seed head. And that the cool thing about sorghum Sudan grass, this is like my latest obsession, is that it has all these, it produces root exudates. So it's putting sugar into the soil, feeding the soil biology, but also putting fine roots into the soil instead of like a big root like a carrot or a radish. And when you chop and drop, when you chop it, it sends those roots even deeper, and then you can chop up the above ground biomass, and that's carbon from the atmosphere turned into green plant matter. And then it'll come back and you can terminate it by cutting it below the soil. But the idea is, yes, you're either chopping up whatever you're chopping down into smaller pieces so that it can decompose on top. Or you can, you've probably seen, you've seen like logs delineating beds. You can do that with herbaceous matter as well. But it will all eventually break down and create soil, and that's the goal. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you elaborate with the wood chips? You said that you don't want to get them in winter because they're dormant at that time, or if you're getting dormant wood chips.
Yeah.
When do you want to get them and why?
You want to get them while there are leaves on the tree, because that's where all the energy is, and the energy is the sugars. Because in the winter, all the vitality is in the roots, but you want the vitality in the above ground material being put onto the soil.
And for what reason?
Because that's what feeds the soil, and that's what it breaks down faster and breaks down into better soil. I mean, if you do dormant trees, it'll still break down in the soil. It just will take longer. It won't be as good. Yeah.
how would you go about, like, I guess personally, I was not aware that McMinnville was considering a community garden. That is so awesome. We came, we were a little bit curious about, like, how do you transition, like, things that were previously timber forests and things like that? Is there a way to start to transition those into more sustainable food forests?
Are you talking about taking pasture and turning it back into a closed canopy forest?
So it's like the space that we're talking about is kind of a mix. There's pasture land, and then there is like older forests that have kind of, it was planted originally for timber and then has just since kind of returned to a later stage.
Okay, is it a healthy stand of trees?
Yeah.
I would, so is your question how to turn that into a food forest?
Well, like, would you just start kind of like incorporating those different food, shrubs and trees, like into the natural habitat already, or like removing starting to pull Doug firs and stuff like that, and leave those as maybe nurse logs and stuff like that?
Totally. Yeah. So it's hard to go from make a closed canopy climax forest into a food forest, because a food forest is kind of like a baby closed canopy.
So you're better starting from like
definitely from pasture is going to be the fastest way to do it. But if you are chopping down, if you're thinning your forest, you're going to have a healthier forest, right? And by opening up sun penetration into the forest floor, you can then plant things into that space. And I would say you're probably not going to be planting plants that need a lot of sunlight, but you can plant elderberries and pawpaws and currants and gumi, things that can take half-day sun. But I would also, if you're going to do that, I would replace those. I mean, Doug fir, I have heard from an indigenous elder who's a permaculture teacher that Doug fir was regarded by some of the indigenous populations here as sort of a weed tree. Like it's not like oak was the keystone tree species, right? Because it feeds everybody, right? And even if it's indirectly, even if you're not eating the acorns, you're eating the deer that are eating the acorns. And Doug fir feeds squirrels and creates habitat for some birds, but it's not producing enough food. So I would invite you to consider planting long-lived nut trees in this space, like English walnut, chestnut, hickory, pecan. The best thing about chestnut is that it produces every year without fail, whereas those other nut trees sometimes take much longer to produce initially, but then also don't produce every year. They'll have like a mast year, they'll produce a ton, and then they don't produce for a couple years. So yeah.
Oh, I had a question about the walnuts in the food forest. Do you plant something around them so that other things can grow around the roots of the walnut? Because a lot of things don't like to grow around walnuts, right?
Have you seen that in your experience?
I've had a walnut and nothing was growing much around it except grass, and then it fell over in a storm anyway.
It
was a big tree.
In my experience, in my personal experience, I've seen walnut trees surrounded by dense lush forest in Wisconsin. I also have a black walnut at one of my food forests, and there's tons of stuff growing around the base of it. And I've listened to 2 podcasts explaining that the juglone allelopathy thing is a myth, and that it's based on 2 accounts, one by Pliny the Elder 2,000 some years ago, where he said that nothing grows in the shade of a walnut, and some guy in the 20s who was trying to grow tomatoes under a walnut, and he said the tomatoes weren't growing well. And everyone's like, oh, we take it as gospel that nothing grows under walnuts. But if you look at a Doug fir in a park or anywhere, there's nothing growing under a Doug fir, but no one's talking about how Doug firs are allelopathic.
Okay.
So I'm not concerned about, I know there are certain things that grow well under walnuts, such as elderberry, pawpaw, currant, like those things all just do fine under walnuts. I mean, I have an almond and a blueberry growing under a walnut. There's a bunch of poke root, which is edible if you're Appalachian, and you know how to poke root.
Poke root.
And there's a huge laurel head. It's like I've never seen walnut actually exhibit allelopathy.
Okay. Well, when I had the walnut trees when I first bought the house, and they hadn't gardened very much, so it's possible that nobody planted anything anyway.
Yeah, or the soil was depleted, or it's just like,
it was kind of a boggy area.
Yeah.
You keep talking about English walnuts, but I don't think they'll grow here unless they're on a different root system.
There are
Yeah.
millions of English walnuts in Portland, like everywhere, and a lot of them are squirrel planted. So, and they produce, I've collected, where's that picture? There we go. So yeah, this is my friend and I, my two friends and I went and collected all these English walnuts in Portland just on the street. There's dropping like hundreds of pounds.
Yeah, but those are probably planted trees that somebody,
You mean-
if you go to a nursery and buy an English walnut, it's gonna have black walnut roots.
I have never heard of that. I'm sure that is done, but I have seen tons of squirrel planted English walnuts that are just, like in wild areas that are dropping tons of fruit, yeah.
McMinnville used to be known as Walnut City.
Really?
Yeah, we
What
got a
happened?
walnut orchard in our backyard, it's 100 years old.
Is it English or?
Yeah, English walnut used to be a big
But
crop.
there are black walnuts that pop up every now and then, so I'm on your page.
I
And
think probably
we used
both
to
things
have,
are true.
we used to have the largest black walnut tree in the city, in our backyard,
Wow.
tiny backyard. And it had to be removed because it was a crazy tree.
Yeah, I bet.
It was gargantuanly huge, and when it dropped, it sounded like you were in a war zone and left stains everywhere the drop landed. You had to drive a truck over, or a car over the nuts to crack
Yeah,
it.
they're.
So I think they're highly overrated, but.
Black walnuts
Black
are for sure,
walnut.
yeah, they're not worth growing. I don't advocate growing black walnuts unless you're growing for timber.
But they do graft the English walnut onto the blacks, because it makes it go better,
Hmm.
until it doesn't. And then the
Yeah,
black walnut comes
walnuts
back.
are native here.
Yeah.
Right.
So can someone clarify for me, who I remember growing up, I swear, going over to Linfield and picking walnuts. But my question relevant to these days is if I wanna plant walnut tree, cause I love walnuts, who do I trust to get walnuts from?
I'd get it from a nursery.
Yeah, you can buy walnut seed stock from Burridge Nursery.
Okay.
But you can also, if there's a walnut tree growing nearby that produces good polynuts, you can just plant those.
Okay.
That's what I've done. They grow really well.
But there are lots of places around here where there are English walnuts and they're old orchards
Yeah.
that have been
And that's what
forgotten,
you have?
because like she said, this used to be Walnut City.
Yeah.
And one of the wineries buildings used to be Walnut City Winery because it was a walnut processing
Oh,
place.
wow, that's cool.
We have lots of walnuts growing on our forest with those sites, we'll plant them, so.
And those are
I
the
was
ones
thinking
that
about
they
letting
eat?
some of them grow, I don't know what they are.
Well, I have an English walnut in my yard, and it produces almost no nuts.
Hmm.
And I think that's been planted, like I said, by a squirrel or something.
Yeah, could be. Yep.
So right now I have a lawn that I mow reluctantly and little trees. What's the next 5 hours of work if I wanted to move towards a permaculture or this? Is it getting that chip drop, getting the paper and covering between those trees and
Yeah, I would, well, the way I do it is you put out one strip of paper and you cover that with wood chip dumps from your 6 cubic foot wheelbarrow. Then you spread them out, then you lay the next strip overlapping. Just do that until it's all covered, and then you can take your time to figure out a design and what you wanna plant and what's available. Yeah.
So you,
but
you
that's
make a
where I was
hole in that construction paper?
Sorry, say that again?
You make holes in the construction paper to put the plants in?
No, well, I mean, it's so you put the wood chips and contractor paper down in August through November, and then by March when you're planting, it's already decomposed. So, I mean, sort of, yes, but yeah.
How deep do you recommend putting the wood chips?
Well, it depends on a couple of factors. You know, ideally 8 inches deep, but that's really deep, and the deeper they are, the harder it is to plant into them, because you gotta rake away all those 8 inches of wood chips. If you have access, if you're getting chip drops reliably, I would do 4 to 6 inches.
Okay.
And then reapply. But if you are having a heck of a time getting wood chips, I would just go 8 inches and
Okay.
deal with the sufferfest of planting do that.
What about the quality of the wood chips you get?
Well, if they're from the back of an arborist truck and they're harvested while the leaves are on the tree, and you're not just getting young fir branches, it's probably gonna be totally fine.
So mostly deciduous wood then?
Ideally deciduous, you can get away with using conifer wood, but it's just gonna take longer to break down. And there's, I would say there's often like essential oils and constituents that are antimicrobial, antifungal, and you want fungus and microbes. So it takes a while for those to dissipate. But you can get, I mean, sometimes if you have a mixed batch, it's fine.
Well, those oils are more in the conifers, is that what you're saying?
What's that?
Those essential oils, that would be.
The higher, they're in
They're
conifers.
higher in the conifers.
Yeah, you don't really have them in hardwoods. And a lot of hardwoods like oak and alder, and cottonwood especially, good strata for mushrooms to grow in, whereas like Doug fir and cedar are not. And fruit tree wood is also not great for mushrooms to grow in, but will break down rapidly, which is good. Got a lot of sugar.
What do you think of wood chips that have horse manure in them, like they offer free at the fairgrounds?
I don't think I would use horse manure from the fairgrounds because of the dewormer in them, or if the horses are eating herbicide-laden grass. Do not want that in your food forest. In theory, the wood chips will be sufficient for fertilization purposes. I would go chicken manure over horse manure. Horse manure is just tricky because there's like all kinds of weird stuff in it, but if chickens are just like eating either grain or kitchen scraps or bugs, that's gonna be way better. And it's high nitrogen, or rabbit manure is great. Yeah, horses are tricky. Unless you know they're getting organic, like 100% organic. Yeah. Fairground horses, I don't know.
Plus, I think all that stuff, the sweepings or the cover from the arenas at the fairgrounds is all conifer.
Oh.
Seems like for killing grass though, I mean, might work in.
Yep.
I'm not an assist in the first 5 minutes, but what's the difference between permaculture and food forests, and is there a massive overlap? And the short answer on that, I'm just curious.
I don't know if I can do a short answer, but I'll try. Permaculture is a design system. Food forests are an aggregation of that design system into a specific expression. Right? So it's taking like all the principles of permaculture and putting it into one thing. Like, but permaculture could be, a rain garden, from the water coming off your roof, and so you're planting plants in a dug ditch that are going to benefit from. So you're taking advantage of a resource that would otherwise just be running away into the sewers.
Right, okay.
And growing plants. So that's like one way to do permaculture. But there's permaculture principles, and I can never remember all of them, but obtain a yield is one of them. Slow and capture rainwater, human care, earth care, people care, earth care, animal care. Mainly, do you know other ones?
No, 12.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them, but you can look up permaculture principles. But ideally, a food forest is checking off each of those principles in its design and in its execution.
Kind of one manifestation of the permaculture
Exactly. And I think it's the apex of permaculture, which is why I'm trying to make food forests happen, because they do all the things that permaculture is trying to do within one system. It's like the most holistic expression of permaculture.
What do the deer do?
The deer?
Yeah, the deer.
Yeah, good question. So
It's a very important question, right?
Yeah, so
They roam down our streets.
I'm curious. Well, okay, I haven't seen the site yet, but excluding deer from a food forest is going to be pretty important. And I don't know if there's NRCS funding for a deer fence, or if there's grant funding for a deer fence. I think that would be paramount. If you're growing large nut trees, you can fence them off individually or put a tree tube on them. But it kind of like a multi-story orchard system, you're gonna have to exclude the deer because they'll eat a lot. But you can plant thorny things around the base of trees, and that will exclude deer as well because they don't want to put their nose into a bunch of thorns. Right.
So I'm Ramsey McPhillips, and part of Edible Landscapes, and so this mystical, food forest that we're planning that maybe some of you aren't aware of. There's $2 billion allocated by the Biden administration through the EPA and the Inflation Recovery Act for communities to do things such as this. And so we're simply applying for $10 to $20 million to put in a major facility that will provide food through the different services in Yamhill County for underserved communities, and also built with principles of permaculture and native culture in its production and execution and planning. And so we're in the process now of pulling this all together. So yes, for $20 million, we will probably have a deer fence. In fact, we're having trouble coming up with the amount of money. You have to spend $10 million, and so it's not like you can ask for 3. So we literally, so there will be a commercial kitchen, there will be an educational component, there will be some facilities for people to lightly use it, not for recreation by any means, but some sort of sanctuary setting where people can come and hang out.
And you guys are gonna need a very highly paid food forest educator.
And we have a very a
Somewhere to live.
named Dan Sloan.
Where's this piece of property?
So we don't have it sealed and deal, but the Hitchcock family, which is out by the New Bridge along Highway 18, there's a beautiful, beautiful piece of property that is being considered. There's lots that we have to decide whether we'll go there, but it would be in perpetuity in union with the family. So that's what we're doing now. The deadline for this grant is November, although we're supposed to get it in much sooner. So anyone who